Excel enables you to build pivot tables from data found both inside and outside the workbook where you create the pivot table. If you want to create a pivot table from a data source you either can't or don't want to import into Excel directly, you can create a connection to that data source and work with it in place. So let's say that you want to create a pivot table using data from another Excel workbook. To do that, you go to the Insert tab and click the Pivot Table button. Then, in the Create Pivot Table dialog box, you select the Use an External Data Source option, and then click Choose Connection. Then, in the Existing Connections dialog box, if the connection or the data source that you want already appears, then you can click it and then click Open. In this case, I haven't created any connections yet, so I will click the Browse for More button. And this displays a version of the Open dialog box. In this case, it's named Select Data Source. The data that I want is in my Exercise Files folder, and that is on my desktop. And it's in Exercise Files, Chapter 1. And the file that I'm using for this exercise is called Outside Source. So I can click that file and then click Open. Then the Select Table dialog box appears, and the Select Table dialog box shows you the different data sources that you can use within that target data source to create your pivot table. In this case, there's only one, and that is named Sheet 2. So it is selected. You can see it's highlighted here in blue. And then I happen to know from working with this data before that the first row of the data does in fact contain column headers, so I can leave that box selected. And then I can click OK. And Excel accepts that choice and sends me back to the Create Pivot Table dialog box. Now I want to create the pivot table on an existing worksheet. So in this case, I have Sheet 1, Cell A1, which is selected here. And when I'm ready, I can click OK. After I click OK, Excel creates the pivot table on Sheet 1. And now I can create the pivot table as I would normally. So let's say, for example, that I want to have my company field in the column labels area, and then the year and quarter in the row labels area, and then the revenue in the values area. And it's a pivot table just like any other pivot table. You can pivot it, filter it, add styles to it, and so on. One important thing to note is that if you use an Excel workbook as your data source, you can't open that workbook while the workbook that contains the pivot table is open. So in other words, if I display my Exercise Files folder and I double-click Outside Source to try to open it, then Excel displays an error dialog box indicating that the file is in use and that it can't open it. In this case, the error is that the file format or file extension is not valid, but that's not the real error. In this case, the file is just in use by another file. So we can click OK to close that dialog box. And now, if I close the external workbook, and I'll do that by pressing Ctrl-W, and I will not save my work, and then go back to my Exercise Files folder. If I double-click Outside Source, then the file opens normally. If possible, you should always draw the data for a pivot table from the original source so that any changes to that source are reflected in the pivot table that you use to analyze your data.